This lecture is going to focus on the preschool years, specifically physical and cognitive development. Just some quick information about physical development, because most of the physical development that the textbook talks about is factual rather than conceptual, and I'd rather focus on some of the more difficult conceptual topics during a lecture. But just some interesting information about how quickly the body is growing. By age 2, infants are 25 to 30 pounds and close to 36 inches tall, and by 6 years old, preschoolers are about 46 pounds and 46 inches tall. So you can see how quickly they are developing at this time. So on to the cognitive stuff, the intellectual development. We're going to be reviewing Piaget's theory and also Vygotsky's theory. Quick overview, remember from what we've been learning, Piaget is focusing on the order of, the operational stages, the sensory motor and pre-operations, concrete operations, and formal operations. And then Vygotsky's theory is going to focus on social interactions and how that encourages learning. So we're on Piaget's theory right now, and remember what we studied in infants was that infants were in the sensory motor stage, and what Piaget says is that really there's not a lot of thinking going on in the sensory motor stage. It's mostly just grabbing things and touching things and kind of uploading information in a way, just kind of trial and error, trying to understand how the world works and those kinds of things. But in these next years, from 2 to 7 years, Piaget is calling this stage pre-operational thinking. He says that at this stage they're still not capable of operations. And remember that operations are organized, formal, logical, mental processes that characterize school-age children, or for pre-operational. That's for school-age children. In general, operations are things that you're doing in your mind, mental calculations, those kinds of things. So some example might be like a logical math calculation, or if I ask you, if I have 5 apples and I take away 3, that's an example of an operation. Or can Liana be in Paris and Cincinnati at the same time? So when I ask you those questions, in your mind you're kind of thinking, well, if Liana's in Paris and she can't be in Cincinnati, unless I go into this really kind of strange hypothetical thinking about parallel universes and all those kinds of things. But in just the kind of flat way of processing through that, and using reason to say, well, if this is true, then this other statement has to be true or not true. That is what Piaget is calling operations. So you're doing something in your mind to calculate something logically. And then in the next stage, after pre-operations, Piaget is going to call this concrete operations, and these are mental operations on physical things. So if I ask you, for example, are there more toys over here or over here, and you're kind of calculating them in your head, then you're doing concrete operations. And then the next stage after concrete operations is formal operations, and these are when you're doing mental operations on abstract things such as ideas or concepts. An example of a formal operation is going to be something like, does the death penalty result in more social justice? So you can see that this is not a concrete concept, a concrete thing. This is an abstract idea, more social justice. And in order for you to be able to think about that, you have to have like a hypothetical abstract idea of what social justice is, and then a way of representing in your mind whether or not there would be more or less of that. And certainly infants cannot do this, and certainly preschoolers cannot do this because they're not so good yet at abstract ideas. And Piaget says that even in the next stage, from 7 to roughly 12, when you're in the concrete operation stage, your middle-aged kids can't do this either, because they can't really think about abstract ideas. But only when you're going into adolescence and into adulthood are we able to actually think abstractly about things like social justice. And Piaget says that they start to use mental operations at the end of this pre-operational stage. But at this point, from the ages of 2 to 7 years, we are still preschoolers are still in this pre-operational thinking. there is this strong relationship between language and how useful language is, especially for developing thought. And you're going to see this explosion that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, this explosion of language development. So a symbolic function is the ability to use words, symbols, or objects to represent something that is not physically present. So if I, ask you to think about an apple or something, you can think about that. Or if I ask you to, to represent food, you can also think about that. By developing language, this allows preschoolers to represent actions symbolically as well, and they can think about they can think beyond the present to the future and consider several possibilities at the same time. But they're not getting to the point where they can do concrete operations in their head or formal operations in their head as well. But again, what the developmental psychologists are saying is that, especially for many people who are focusing on language, that a child must first develop language so they can think symbolically, and then once they've mastered these kinds of ideas in their head and also on a physical level have enough neural connections, the actual physiology of the brain, to be able to think abstractly and to be able to do the operations in their mind, then this is when they will be able to do those things. But until this point, preschoolers are functioning at a very basic kind of a level in terms of they can think symbolically, but not yet to the point where they can perform those operations inside of their mind. So one thing, for example, that characterizes preschoolers thinking is something called centration. Centration is the process of concentrating on one limited aspect of a stimulus and ignoring other aspects. So it involves the inability to consider all available information about a stimulus. So I'm going to show you an example on the next slide of centration. What happens is that preschoolers often get focused on superficial, obvious elements that are within sight rather than thinking more deeply about what they're looking at. So this right here, this problem here that I'm going to show you is an example of centration. So if you are a preschooler and I show you these buttons right here and I ask you which row contains more buttons, you as your real self, as a late adolescent or perhaps in early adulthood, you're probably thinking, well, I can look at it quickly and estimate, but the best approach to do is to count. But preschoolers who are kind of stuck in this centration problem, they will just look at this obvious aspect of the fact that the lower level is longer, and if it's longer and it looks bigger, there therefore must be more buttons. But if you count them, you'll see that you'll find that there are 10 buttons on the top and 8 buttons on the bottom, and that's obvious to us. And in fact, even when we ask preschoolers which was bigger, 8 or 10, they know that 10 is bigger, so they can do that in they understand that process, or they understand that concept that 10 is bigger than 8. But when you ask them to look at this and say which row has more buttons, they'll say the lower row, just because this obvious feature of it being longer is what they're focusing on. This is centration. Another characteristic of thinking of preschoolers is egocentrism. Preschoolers do not yet understand that others have different perspectives from their own. And you can see how this is very much related to what we were talking about in the infant chapter when we were talking about theory of mind. So right around this point, the end of infancy and in early preschool, this is when all of these mental processes that are related to being able to take the perspective of another are developing. And remember, it doesn't just happen overnight, and it isn't always consistent. Once they get it, it doesn't mean that they're able to take the perspective of anybody. Sometimes it'll kind of come in on Wednesday, and then a couple days later on Saturday you might ask them the same question and they don't get it right that time. So it's kind of like they're kind of grappling with this to try to kind of understand this. And I think you might have had this experience in your own sometimes, maybe when you're trying to learn something complicated like calculus or something, and then for a moment you kind of get it, and then like an hour later you're like, okay, I had it, but it's kind of fading. I don't quite get that. So that's an example of your brain, developing and then being able to put memories together to understand something. Well, infants and preschoolers are experiencing the same thing, but of course on a much larger scale because their brain is growing so rapidly. So they're going to have these moments of insight, and then they're going to kind of lose it a little bit, but then eventually, of course, it'll level out, and they are able to grasp things like taking the perspective of another. But at this point, they have lots of egocentrism. And egocentric thought can take two forms. They can have a lack of awareness that others see things from a different physical perspective. So, for example, if there's two sides of a coin, of course, there's two sides of a coin, and if I'm holding up a coin to you, and you're an infant or an early preschooler, and you see the head side of it, but I see the tail side of it, you also think that I see the head side of it because you assume, as an infant or early preschooler, or even mid preschooler, that I see what you see. That's the inability to take the physical perspective of another. And second, they fail to realize that others may hold thoughts, feelings, and points of view that are different from them. So if an infant finds something funny, they'll assume that you must also find it funny because it is funny, rather than saying, well, I find it funny, but other people may not understand why this is funny. You might know some adults like this as well who are not able to take the perspectives of others so well. So that was Piaget and some aspects of intellectual development or cognitive development. What we're going to talk about here for the next few slides is Vygotsky. This is Vygotsky's view of cognitive development. Overall, his theory says that cognition is the result of social interactions in which children learn through guided participation. So you can see he's very much focused on learning and the educational process, and you will see that a lot of our education system builds on Vygotsky's theories on how we should structure school. And he also says that children gradually grow intellectually and begin to function on their own because of assistance that adult and peer partners provide. So on the next slide, we're going to see kind of how his theory plays out. A major component of his theory is something called the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is the level at which a child can almost, but not fully, perform a task independently, but can do it with assistance. So if we're looking for what a student's zone of proximal development is, like where are they at? For example, let's apply this to you. Your zone of proximal development, if you've taken an algebra course, is algebra, but so that's your zone of proximal development, because going into algebra 2 or statistics is just within your reach, because now you're ready to grab the next level. But if someone were to introduce, advanced quantum mathematics or something, then that you probably would have a hard time getting that even with assistance, because myself included, because that's so far, it's too many levels up. So bringing this down to preschoolers, maybe they are at the level of understanding how to do some very simple math, but we wouldn't introduce algebra to them because that's so far above simple math. So if they're right at the point where they're kind of starting to get addition, then we could probably start pushing them towards subtraction, because that's their zone of proximal development. The fundamental principle here is that cognition increases through exposure to information that is new enough to be intriguing, but not too difficult. If it's too difficult, one, they might just disengage just from frustration, but which I think is what adults tend to do. But more likely, their brains just are incapable of holding that much information at one time. Think about if you were to attend a seminar or something on something that you have never experienced before. Maybe somebody shows you how to do heart surgery, and they go through everything on how to actually do open heart surgery in 3 minutes, and they show you everything, and then say, okay, now you try it. That's going to be so far outside of the likelihood that you're going to be able to do that, because there's too many concepts that you would need to pay attention to all at once. But if they go step by step and spread it out and kind of increase the difficulty of what you're performing gradually, then you'll be more likely to get it. And I want to point out that college also teaches this way. So whenever I'm designing learning experiences, I'm thinking, okay, where are the students' zone of proximal development? I don't necessarily use those terms, but I try to imagine what you are probably thinking about these kinds of concepts, and then I'll try to go just a little bit beyond that. I wouldn't start talking about something that I learned in multivariate statistics, because some of you may not be interested, and it just might be there might just be too many concepts that you're unfamiliar with, because it would just take too long to explain all of them. And so, of course, the nursing program teaches this way too. The nursing courses, they'll start off with very basic nursing skills and then work you up to more complicated kinds of interactions and treatments and processes. The way that we do this, the method of this, that educators and people and parents do, is something called scaffolding. Scaffolding is support for learning and problem solving that encourages independence and growth. So if you just give a preschooler a problem and let them alone, that isn't scaffolding, because you're not really providing any support. But if you encourage them, and if you maybe ask them questions so that they could they could start putting concepts together, this is scaffolding. So scaffolding, I like to think of scaffolding like when you are someone's painting a house and they put that metal framework around the house so that the painters can get to higher and higher levels. This is kind of how I think about scaffolding in the cognitive way, that you're basically building steps for somebody, and just to expect someone to jump on the roof to paint the roof, from the ground, that's not going to work. But if you provide them scaffolding steps, they can follow those steps and then get up to higher levels. This aids in development of overall cognitive abilities because you are helping them reach higher levels. Let's talk a little more about the growth of language and learning, because it's so important to this stage in particular, and of course ultimately to socialization, that we'll talk about in the next chapter, and just to cognitive performance in general. So during the preschool years, sentence length increases at a very steady pace, and so does syntax. Syntax is the ways that words and phrases can be combined to form sentences. So even if you just take that sentence, the ways that words and phrases can be combined, think about how many different ways you can move that around, but to still say the same thing. But keep in mind that there are still some syntax rules. There are certainly some ways and combinations of these words that we could move the words around in certain ways where the sentence would no longer make any sense or would mean something entirely different. So as long as the syntax are basically the rules of combining things so that they still make sense. This doubles each month during the preschool years. So the ability to comprehend and also produce, this is to produce syntax, different syntaxes, is growing very quickly. There are enormous leaps in the number of words used, something called through fast mapping. What is fast mapping? Fast mapping is where new words are associated with their meaning after only a brief encounter. So I like to think about our adult brains and how they work. So imagine you trying to learn a new language, and like, for example, I'm trying to learn Spanish right now, and when an adult is introduced a word, they will usually have to repeat it over and over and over, and they may not grasp it right away. They might get it, but then forget it, the next day or the next hour or the next second. It just kind of goes. But preschoolers' brains are like language sponges. They even with a brief encounter to the word, then preschoolers are remembering these words very quickly, and they're getting their meanings from the syntax. For example, where you're kind of associating the meaning or understanding the meaning quickly. An example of this would be, if I say, "Hey, hand me that balanga over there," and then I didn't say what the balanga was, but by the context of the words, you can look at what I'm referring to and then understand what that means. So, but preschoolers are kind of masters about figuring things out very quickly. And keep in mind that it isn't really it's not something they're aware that they're doing, and they're not intentionally doing it. There is most likely something in the brain that is turning their brain into a language sponge at this point, and just soaking up language like there's no tomorrow. Uh, by the age of 6, the average child has a vocabulary of around 14,000 words. So, I mean, look at what they've accomplished from, if the first word was about age 1, and then all the way to age 6, they've got 14,000 words. So imagine being able to get 14,000 words of a new language by the time, in 5 years from now. So let's say you start learning Greek or Russian. Do you think that you would have a vocabulary of 14,000 Russian words in 5 years? Maybe if you studied really hard. Vocabulary in preschoolers is acquired of a rate of nearly one word every 2 hours over a 24-hour period. So we're talking about 12 hours a day. I'm sorry, 12 words a day. This isn't in the textbook, but I do think it's kind of interesting. Since I'm trying to learn Spanish, there is a polyglot blogger. A polyglot is somebody who speaks multiple languages, not just bilingual, but 3, 4, 5 languages. His name is Benny Lewis, and he is fluent in 7 languages. And his method, he says, is that you have to immerse yourself in the language. If you just kind of are still speaking English through the day, but you just kind of try to throw in some vocabulary words, he's like, it's going to be really slow. But what you have to do is completely stop using your native language and only use that new language. So it kind of trains your brain to think in those words and continually use them and rehearse them and just kind of be in that mindset. And he says that if you do that for 3 months, then you will get to the point where you're starting to become fluent, because it's just kind of becoming so automatic. And if you think about it, this is the way infants are learning. They don't have a language, so they're starting off with a blank slate. So when you are learning a language, if you try to learn a second language, you're always filtering everything through English, most likely for people who have English as a first language. So you're kind of always relying on using English and then having to translate, which is why Benny Lewis says, well, get out of that habit. You have to go and immerse yourself. Don't even let your friends use English around you. They should only be using that language, and then you will learn it much faster, because this is what infants are doing. Infants don't have a first language yet, so everything has to be. If they want anything, they have to kind of rely on the languages. If they're not using pointing and gestures and those kinds of things. I just thought that was interesting, so I wanted to point that out to you. I haven't immersed myself in the language yet. Right now I'm just using an app called Duolingo, but it's kind of fun. Oh, just to give you a little more information about his method, he says that what you want to do is start with a base vocabulary. So get yourself up to like 1,000 words. Just say, okay, I'm going to just try to memorize, 10 words every day, for 100 days, and get myself up to 1,000 words, just so that I can just recognize them. And then he said, then take that vocabulary and immerse yourself completely, and you'll be able to recognize, your basic words like food and run and eat and water and those kinds of things. But because you're using them so regularly, then you'll start getting the syntax and the building your vocabulary and those kinds of things. What preschoolers are also really good at is the appropriate formation of words. So here's an example. If I say, this is a wug, and I say, now look here. Now there is another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2, and then of course you would say, well, there's 2 wugs. Because you just kind of automatically are applying the rules that we know, and preschoolers are also really good about being able to do this. Unfortunately, English is one of those languages where there's so many exceptions to grammar. So we should, we should be consistent, but we know that there's some plurals, like fungi. You got a fungus, and then a plural fungi, that break the rules. But of course, kids, they will usually make the errors and say funguses, or those kinds of things. So what about practical communication? So this is called in the language world, this is called pragmatics. Pragmatics relates to communicating effectively and appropriately with others. So it's not about the right vocabulary, but it's like using the rules effectively. This would involve things like taking turns. So you have to, even though that sounds really basic to us, preschoolers don't understand this yet, as you can see, as they just kind of talk over you and they don't really wait back for a response. So understanding that language involves taking turns is one of the rules of pragmatics, or sticking to a topic. Again, you might also have some friends, or maybe even yourself, that isn't so good at sticking to a topic. But the general rules of communication are stick to a topic, and then when you're going to transition, then there should be a reason to transition, or at least put up a signpost in your language. Oh, I'm going to talk about this because I just thought of this, those kinds of things. Also things like what should and should not be said according to the conventions of society. So, even though, for example, I might be making little jokes throughout the lecture, I know there's some things that are inappropriate to make jokes about because they would offend you or turn you off, or they're just so terrible to talk about that I just don't talk about them. And the interesting thing is that they're similar throughout the world, like bathroom humor and those kinds of things are kind of in general just not discussed in mixed company. But there's also some things that cultures are specific about. For example, when I was doing some consulting in Saudi Arabia, it was understood that dogs were not something that was appropriate to talk about because dogs were kind of considered a dirty animal. It might be kind of like maybe here a little bit talking about pigs or rats. And it's just kind of like, we don't really want to talk about those things. So we were told, ahead of time, when you're talking to people, don't talk about your dog because that's kind of seen as just something you don't talk about. It's not really an appropriate thing to talk about. And of course, for us, that seems so foreign. But think about it from their perspective, that they would never understand unless they have this convention in their culture. I'm not sure, but if they would not understand why sticking your middle finger up is a bad thing. When over here it's like, oh my God, they stuck their middle finger up. Somebody does it by accident, everybody laughs. It's so funny. But over there it's like, well, that just doesn't make any sense. And in the same way that not talking about your dog doesn't make sense to us. And of course, use of different language in various settings. So when I'm talking to my buddies, I'll probably use different kinds of words than when I'm talking to students. With my buddies, I might, use things like, I'm not even so sure I use a lot of lingo, but just kind of more lingo, kinds of terms that I just more informal kinds of language that I would, I might say, dude. Okay, that's a good one. Might call one of my friends dude or refer to him like, hey dude, but I would not do that to a student because I'm in a different setting. All of these, pragmatics. And in terms of pragmatics and how this applies to preschoolers, before the age of 3, the infants are really only speaking for their own entertainment. They're just kind of talking, and then maybe, as Piaget would say, to kind of test things out. What happens if I do this? And then they're kind of, in some ways, just unaware if anyone else can even understand what they're saying, and they're not so purposeful about vocalizing. But during the preschool years, we begin to see, they begin to direct their speech to others. So they understand, like, when I'm talking, I'm going to say it to this person because this person will be able to do these kinds of things for me. And it's important that others listen. I always think it's kind of cute, when you see like a preschooler like grab the face of somebody and like pull it toward them so they can look at them, like pay attention to me. They will become frustrated when they cannot make themselves understood. So if they're trying to say that they want something but they don't have a word for it, and the caregivers or the listener is not understanding, they can get frustrated. So again, this understands need and also understands this kind of ability to the theory of mind, that if you're aware that the other person isn't getting it, then that shows that you're aware of the other person's mind, what they're doing. And they begin to adapt their speech to others through pragmatics. So I say these kinds of things to some kind of people. I'm being repeatedly told I shouldn't make bathroom humor in school, that kind of stuff. And preschoolers are starting to get that fairly early on. So just some quick information about early education programs. So some examples of that might be like Head Start programs. So we have kindergarten, and then we have preschool, and then kind of even the year before that or around that time, we have things called Head Start programs and other kinds of programs across the country. And these are intentionally designed because we know that getting really good evidence-based interactions with late infants and early preschoolers is really good for their development. We have these really interesting examples of kids that did not get a lot of development when they were 3, 4, 5, 6, and it can really have a lasting impact on their development because it slows their development on language and social skills and those kinds of things. So to me, it makes sense from a community perspective to establish programs where we can get, again, evidence-based kinds of developmental experiences for preschoolers to help with their development. And children who are in these programs are more verbally fluent, show memory and comprehensive advantages, and achieve higher IQ scores than the kids that just stayed at home. And of course, this is comparing a large group against a large group. So if you're keeping your child at home, but you're doing all the same kinds of things that the people in the early education program are doing, then of course your child would probably see these gains as well. But the main point is, of course, is that these programs are using what we know about preschool development to help develop kids. And there are these children in early education programs are also more self-confident, independent, and knowledgeable about the social world in which they live than those who do not participate in these programs. So what would make a good program great? So the characteristics of good quality child care. So this is in general, not just early education programs, but programs in general. You want to know that the providers are well trained. So I know sometimes people mean well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they really do understand what some of the most the best evidence-based practices are. So think about, you could have somebody who wants to be a nurse and they really have really great intentions, but they may not be trained so well on the processes and they can really screw things up. You want to make sure there's an overall size and ratio of care providers to children, and states have different kinds of mandates about how many caregivers, care providers you must have per child, or I should say that the other way around, how many children you can have per care provider. You want to make sure that there's a curriculum that is carefully planned and coordinated among the teachers, so they should all be on the same plan. You want a language rich environment. And that caregivers are sensitive to children's emotional and social needs. Materials and activities are age appropriate. Somebody might mean well and think, oh, I'm going to try to work on, this kid's algebra skills, when he's 5, but that's just going to frustrate the kid and bore him to death probably. Make sure that basic health and safety standards, of course, are followed, and at least one meal is served daily, and one family support service is provided.